I think this year you released the translation of Fortunati's Arcane of Reproduction. And
Yes, yes.
she argues in that book that reproductive labor produces surplus value, which is a break with Marxist or orthodoxy. Her analysis turns on valorization, mediation through the male wage, and command within the domestic sphere. What is at stake politically in her insistence on direct productivity of reproductive labor?
That's a great question. I think there's actually a very complicated answer, in part because I think so much gets made of this debate, right, as to whether or not reproductive work, domestic reproductive, if you want to call it labor, in the sense that it could be thought of as abstract and socially necessary, right? Whether this is productive of surplus value or not. And there's a whole back and forth. Sometimes between, I think between folks who are following Lise Fogel and this earlier, the sort of domestic labor debates in an Anglo-American context, and the Italian claims, and then as this plays itself out, and people still kind of rehash the debate, often fairly inaccurately, in my opinion, but you can't expect academics to be accurate. The history, I mean, I say this, I stand guilty as well. I'm not saying this to like accuse one side or the other, right? I mean, people are often quite partisan, consciously or not, in their presentation of intellectual lineage. I tend to think it probably has more to do with problems of translation and machination of political groups and academic claims for academic power, making the long march through the universities, as we say, then people like to let on. I don't know that it's possible really to distill to a purely theoretical debate, in part because, in fact, what Fortunati says is that that reproductive labor appears or presents itself as not producing value, right? But in fact, creates the only condition in which value can be produced, and you can then therefore subject it to, I mean, she's not even necessarily saying it's properly Marxist, because many of the Apparisti even, they call themselves Marxian. They don't necessarily say that this is proper orthodox Marxism. They're saying that it's necessary as a theoretical and political venture, right? And that it is decidedly biased even. I mean, for Christ's sake, Tronti will say you have to write from the perspective of the hatred of capitalism. The book itself is this weapon stolen from the boss's arsenals. It's inherently evil, and that's part of this claim. The claim for wages for housework is it's not a good thing. There's what I think is kind of a specious argument that's made, that the wages for housework people were making a moralistic argument, and maybe some of them were. I mean, to claim, right, to claim that, and they'll say, well, it's a moralistic argument, i.e., it's not a properly Marxist and rigorously theoretical argument. I think making that claim is a moralizing claim in itself, but let's step beyond that, right? It's saying, you're not a proper theorist, so you're sabotaging the revolutionary project, is its implication.
I think
Yeah.
one of the insights in Fortunati's work is how the wage
Hmm.
conceals capital's relationship to women by routing it through men. Whereas
Absolutely.
Dalla Costa emphasizes how wage organizes social life, even where there is no
Mm-hmm.
compensation, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the frameworks kind of help us rethink wage not as a
Yeah.
reward. What are your thoughts on that? But as a sort of disciplining
Wage,
mechanism.
absolutely. And, I guess I would point out that, the Arcana of Reproduction, the Arcana of Reproduction is Fortunati's attempt at like distillation and operating at a very high level of abstraction and it's this sort of feminist variation on an operaist Marxian themes. It does get fleshed out, I think, in terms of social relations and history in other works that are written at the same time and published in the context of a movement, right? So
Yeah.
I think she would certainly agree, like that the wage is fundamentally a disciplinary mechanism, as she makes clear in Bruto Ciao, that work with Mariarosa della Costa, right? And in fact, the wage is what gives the husband this kind of dual position where they are both subjected and both done to, and the doers, right? Creates this kind of cis masculine subject, right, that wants to be utterly degraded and subservient and obedient, yet domineering and entitled, right?
Hmm.
And I would also say that, Fortunati does make it very clear that this division, right, if you actually read the Arcana of Reproduction, and, I don't expect everyone to read it this closely, but I translated it or co-translated it with a wonderful collaborator, Sara Colantuono, who knows a whole lot more about Italian histories of feminism than I do in different traditions. But she makes it clear that this division between production and reproduction is one that happens to the subject in general, right? The subject as a kind of negative universal of capitalism, right? It happens to, in other words, it happens to men, put in, very plain kind of cisgendered language, right? And they are not like subject to it nearly in the same kind of oppressive and mystifying fashion that women are, but it still happens to them. In other words, they, are no longer reproduced, or they don't reproduce themselves, as subjects who are part of a community who trade and interact and have their place in whatever, socio-symbolic exists. They are free, quote unquote, as labor power that must be sold, and then they do something else, that reproduces themselves. So I would say this holds true even, for like the most despicable, like manosphere character or something who just, sits behind his computer ordering takeout all day, and masturbating and talking about how women hate him, right? They are still reproducing themselves, right, as labor power that must be paid somehow, even if they're unemployed, and even if that is then mediated by their parents or by government subsidies or whatever, right? You know, and maybe thanks to a whole history of struggles, they are not expendable. They're not like yet immediately just cast out to beg and pick rags like they may have been in the in the kind of classic period of so-called primitive accumulation, but they are still paid by something, right? Yeah, and they're still subject to this division between production and reproduction, right?
What's interesting about Federici is she
Mm.
approaches these questions not through value, but through accumulation.
Mm.
And she argues that capitalism emerges through reproductive violence. And she does that through a historical analysis of witch hunts, land
Mm.
dispossession, and colonialism, in a way reframing Marxist periodization.
Mm.
What are your thoughts on that? And could you elaborate on that difference maybe from what you've read?
Yeah. Well, so one of the texts that I've really enjoyed translating recently has been the original collaborative work between Fortunati and Federici, Il Grande Calibano. I can maybe hold it up here, but which they wrote together throughout the late 80s. I'm sorry, throughout the late 70s. It wasn't published until 83. But even there, I think you do sort of see their difference in approach, right? Like the two chapters that Silvia authors solo are these wonderful chapters: Il Grande Calibano, La lotta contro il corpo ribelle, the great Caliban, the struggle against the rebel body, and La caccia alle streghe, the witch hunt, right? Which, appear after much development and reworking and revision in Caliban and the Witch, right? When that is published, not until actually the late 90s, in a small edition, and then larger edition, early 2000s, I believe, by Autonomist. And those are wonderful. Those are incredible chapters that she works and reworks. And she also has this experience, this added experience of going to Nigeria, right? She and George go and they get these teaching positions in Nigeria. And yeah, I mean, sub-Saharan Africa had some of the best, best institutions of higher education at the time. I mean, and some of those flourishing Marxian traditions. I mean, the Dar es Salaam University, where Wamba Diawamba was teaching, and all the the institutions throughout Nigeria were great. They've kept up with many colleagues. But then there is this like dramatic restructuring of loans with the Volcker shock in '79 and the euphemistically called structural adjustment in the early 80s, where public institutions are defunded and privatized, and most brutally, student protests are brutally repressed. Democratic movements are often brutally repressed. So she sees this, and the whole Circle of Midnight Notes, I think, which is the collective that she and George are part of, at the time, which also includes people like Peter Linebaugh, Monty McNeil, etc. Right? They see this as the new enclosures, right? As a new round of primitive accumulation. And Fortunati's contributions to the work. Well, I mean, she obviously they both collaborate and share work, or in some ways, I think collaborating throughout. Her two solo author chapters are there's this incredible chapter on the use value of sex, right? Of sexuality, basically, which is almost a book unto itself, and is just about this transition to capitalism, not necessarily as having like a dramatic event that can be placed historically, but having this whole entire process of repositioning, re-educating, reformulating the guidelines for sexuality. The ways it's different from a Foucauldian historiography are quite interesting. I think it's actually somewhat closer to a psychoanalytic history, but that's a longer story. But there's they're just fascinating. And I would point out that like l'arcano della riproduzione, right? The term l'arcano is actually in Italian. If you were reading it in Italian, it would very clearly reference the mystery of primitive accumulation. So Marx uses Geheimnis der ursprüngliche Accumulation, right? The mystery of originary accumulation. The English translation is notoriously terrible. And I think, thankfully they have finally revised it in this new Penguin edition of Marx Volume 1. But, because primitive has such terrible connotations of stagist, of a 19th century racist historiography of all of these, things. Marx actually uses the term ursprünglich, which is more like a Hegelian notion of origins out of nothing, right? And in fact, it's his most like mythopoetic and, kind of like, it's almost like horror comedy, not in the trivial, popular culture way we think of it today. There are all these like terrible kitsch horror comedies out there. But, everything is dripping with fire and blood. I mean, what is masked by the myth of the Robinsonade, of Robinson Crusoe out, with his good friend Friday, is in fact the most horrific violence and colonization and slavery, etc. Right. So he's using the Hegelian term ursprünglich, I think, in a parodic fashion, actually, and that's just not always recognized in the history of Marx. So I mean, I would say that they actually complement each other, maybe Federici and Fortunati's use of the term, because indeed, it's real historical trauma. It's also a terrible kind of ongoing structure and repetition that's kind of inherent to capitalist development. It always needs some site to like, decommodify and profit from. And that could be war, that could be exciting new technologies that derive value from, mapping our faces while we have a discussion today and detecting our moods and then advertising to us, right? I mean, there can always be some new site. Not to trivialize or flatten the difference between, what's happening in Palestine, say, and, and targeted marketing, right? Because of course there is all the world of difference. And that's in fact what's, so pernicious about it, is it so normalizes violence that it can normalize um, you know,
Yeah.
cultures and peoples.